I'm David Beck, and from Impact Alpha, this is an Agents of Impact podcast.
We really think holistically about development because it's more than just getting, a plant constructed and operational. It's also figuring out how you do this by partnering and collaborating with the local communities in a way that honors the cultural, uniqueness of these places, but also takes advantage of the infrastructure that's been vacated by a lot of these industries that are converting their technology.
That's Brett Isaac, co founder and CEO of Navajo Power. I caught up with Brett and his colleague Michael Cox to learn how indigenous owned Navajo Power is building out utility scale solar projects, not just in Navajo Nation, but on tribal lands across the country. The company has some unique advantages and unique challenges in transitioning Indian country from fossil fuels and capturing the good jobs and other benefits of the clean energy economy for Native peoples. With the Kellogg Foundation, Impact Alpha is lifting up investment strategies that are expanding opportunity in a complex operating environment. Let's jump right in. Welcome, Brett Isaac and Michael Cox, to the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
We've been tracking Navajo Power for a number of years, and Brett, I think you've been on one of our Agents of Impact calls, and we think it's such an interesting model for on so many fronts. And I know there's a sort of origin story that we've heard about the closure of a coal plant on Navajo Nation that somehow sparked the beginnings of this idea. So, Brett, maybe just tell us the beginnings.
Yeah, thank you, David. I always say that, I grew up in the shadow of that coal mine that was feeding the coal plant that was operating in the Western Navajo Nation for a couple of decades. And it was the Navajo Generating Station was the largest coal-fired power plant west of the Mississippi. And in 2019, it was retired. And the years leading up to that retirement were a lot of, political and social questions about how you engage a transition like that, going from a fossil fuel-based economy to whatever comes next. And myself was really interested and invested in trying to make sure that the impacts were minimized as far as the negative ones, and that we really looked at the opportunity. And so the birth of Navajo Power was really as a result of those conversations about how do we embrace the next version of energy economy, and also how do we help foster and nurture the communities that have been adversely impacted by all these different industries, but are really looking for opportunities to bring themselves out of these situations by embracing, clean technology, and also, looking at the ways that you can strategically be involved in the, development of new energy projects. And we felt that, the expertise to do that was largely missing from the marketplace. And so creating Navajo Power was really a response from myself and the co-founders, and in taking on, one of the biggest challenges of our era, to try to help some of these communities retool their economies to be tuned to this energy, boom that we're seeing with solar, wind, and all these other, green technologies.
And so the idea is utility scale solar on native lands and the benefits that flow from that, both in clean power, but also payments, leasing and power generation. So just maybe sketch out how it all fits together.
Yeah, I mean, we always say the Navajo Nation was the battery for the Southwest. For decades, the natural resources that, were mined and processed on the Navajo Nation, created the electrons that built the city of Phoenix, the city of Las Vegas, the city of Los Angeles. And, those years of, you know, subsidized electrons helped these municipalities build into these economic powerhouses. And what we're trying to accomplish is, one, to continue that relationship with these areas by building projects that continue to supply a new cleaner electron, but also using it to start amending and rectifying some of the economic conditions that have kind of sprouted in these communities in the wake of those industries. So trying to create better job opportunities and utilize the economic opportunities and investment and ownership to figure out how we can start addressing a lot of the social issues with high unemployment and access to infrastructure. So, we really think holistically about development because it's more than just getting, a plant constructed and operational. It's also figuring out how you do this by partnering and collaborating with the local communities in a way that honors the cultural, uniqueness of these places, but also takes advantage of the infrastructure that's been vacated by a lot of these industries that are converting their technology.
Michael, you come at this from the world of sustainable finance and impact investing. What appealed to you about this company?
What appealed to me about Navajo Power was the scale of the challenge, the complexity of it, and my career has always been mission aligned with sustainability one way or another. And Navajo Power just checked all of those boxes and then some for me. And what I realized, after joining the company was that I had a much deeper relationship to the set of challenges on Navajo than I realized because I was one of these kids growing up in Southern California, benefiting from that cheap coal power being produced on Navajo. And every time I turned the lights on, the Navajo Nation was powering my home essentially. And I didn't realize that until I became part of the company. But there's this incredible juxtaposition of 15,000 households on Navajo without reliable electricity, and then kids like me and the Inland Empire in California benefiting from their resources.
It's such an interesting relationship, and I grew up in Los Angeles as well, and I think turned on my lights with that power as well. So I hear you. Bring us up to date on kind of where the actual projects are. I know there's the Painted Desert Power Project. I think is going to be your first and kind of emblematic project. So tell us what you're up to.
Yeah, the Navajo Power started in the Navajo Nation. We really were born from all those conversations that I was having in my community. And we started a project in the corridor that was, the Navajo Generating Station's, power market, which is, serving Western Electricity Coordinating Council. And we've been developing a 750 megawatt project for a number of years to try to replace some of the economics and the jobs that were lost during the Navajo Generation Station closure. And for, the last 6 years, we've been doing a lot of like the foundational work. These communities, all had their economies, intertwined with a lot of the fossil fuel resources that were there. And so uncoupling a lot of like the, very like, I guess I would say industry friendly policies to adapt them to these new technologies and the way that they're financed has been a lot of the work that we've been focused on. Essentially, there's always been, kind of an understanding that a lot of indigenous communities have the resource potential to site projects of the size and scale that we need. I mean, this is, over 4,500 acres of land that would be covered with solar panels. There's not a lot of places in the country that can host things like that and also have the auxiliary infrastructure, including, transmission lines and interconnection points that would make these things feasible, for competitiveness in these regional marketplaces. So, we've done a lot of that work to one, create the technical viability, but also start, creating precedent and laying the foundations in these communities to test unproven policy that was created to help these communities, permit and regulate and lease, these properties so that they can improve their economies. There's been a lot of growth in the public sector for tribes in terms of their capacity taking on a lot of the responsibility for administering these projects, but they still are really limited by just there's a lot of changing and evolving metrics. You look at the national conversation around tax credits and all the things that influence these projects. Dealing with those things in real time requires like these pilot projects to navigate the mechanics of those things, and that's where we've been spending a lot of our time working with the different regulatory bodies, with the Navajo Nation, to figure out permitting regimes and to, also create these very complex and intricate contracts, but use that under the framework of, indigenous sovereignty and tribal sovereignty to protect the nationhood of these communities so that, one, finance can figure out how to play in these marketplaces, but also tribes can feel like they're insulated, and then protected in these deals so that there isn't anything that would make them compromise any of the sovereignty that they've been holding on to for centuries. And that's really like the work that we've been, laying the last couple of years is figuring those things out and getting more certainty on our projects.
And David, just to put some numbers to that a little bit. So we have 5 projects currently at Navajo Power with 4 different tribal nations, totaling a little over 2 gigawatts of potential power generation. And if fully built out, that would equal about $4 billion of, economic investment into those communities and nations.
That's ambitious. I know there's been a lot of talk, of permitting reform and streamlining, the processes, and there's a kind of buzz on about abundance and kind of breaking through some of the obstacles that have held back the ability to build projects like this. Give us just a little flavor of what kinds of things you have to work through to realize that ambitious goal.
Yeah, I think one of the most unique overlaying aspects of working in tribal communities is just you have a different way of, getting permission for projects. The land status is very similar to like federal land, like Bureau of Reclamation or Bureau of Land Management land, where there's this public process for, providing information and getting consent for these projects. That is, it makes the stakeholder engagement much more grassroots oriented. So you have to build a really strong base of support from the community members because essentially, that's the most consistent, stakeholder that you have because, all the governments and other things have term limits and different administration changes. So, that level of focus allows us to really focus on what actual benefits come from these projects and makes that a condition for how you move these projects through the community is getting their consent alongside building the mechanics for how they can realize those benefits, whether it's workforce development, revenues for the local community and the local municipalities. There's all these elements that, we talk about in the impact framework in terms of like what we want to see out of these projects. We're working on the actual details of how those things will be accomplished. And we always say success is beyond just getting infrastructure built. It's actually having a legacy of standing behind these agreements and making sure that the impacts that we, are bringing to these communities can be seen in positive light.
And to give you a little bit more of a window into that consent process that Brett's talking about, so take Painted Desert Power on the Navajo Nation as an example. Brett spent the better part of 2 years connecting with 30 different grazing permit holders and their entire families, each of whom had to sign off and consent to the project. Any one of them could have killed it, and still to this day they could withdraw their consent and still create a lot of challenges. That's one layer. Then beyond that, we have to get the 2 chapters where the project exists, which are like the municipalities in the Navajo Nation, to vote in favor of the project. And once that was accomplished, then we have a provisional site control status called land withdrawal. Then we moved to the Navajo Nation central government, and we've been working with the Department of Justice for the last couple of years to iron out every single detail on the lease. And this has never been done before by a private company. So we're literally like, carving the path with the government as we go to get this first lease done. And then the president signs off, which is the step we're at right now. We just got the Department of Justice to sign off recently. Now the president signs off, and then it goes to the council, which is like that's the legislative body of the Navajo Nation, and the Resource and Development Committee approves the final lease. and then we have lease, then we can go get a power purchase agreement and move towards construction. This has been a 5-year process, and no other developer has gotten anywhere near that close. And frankly, like no other investment group besides the kind of philanthropic and impact um, community that we've had behind us would take on that level of risk and uncertainty over so many years to pursue something like this.
Let's just take that up because I can imagine, the financing needs for a $4 billion worth of projects on the one hand, and then these kinds of risks and obstacles on the other makes financing a challenge. So how do you think about raising capital to support the work now, and then also to, get the projects built?
The counterintuitive thing is that the billions are the easiest part to raise. Because once a project has all of the permissions, has all of the engineering, has the power purchase agreement, that's when you go out and finance the construction, which is the billions of dollars. And there's a very competitive marketplace of huge financial institutions that want those projects. The hardest money to raise is the money into the top co, the corporate capital and the pre-development capital to make a company like this exist, and then to take projects from inception, to a place where they can be invested in by, the big entities. So it's been quite a journey, and we've raised money for that top co-investment and for that early stage pre-development and early stage development of projects um, constantly since the company was started about a little over 7 years ago, and we've put about $25 million, a little over 25 million together over time in a seed round concessionary debt, which was a little over 10 million. We're organizing our Series A right now. We did a first close of $4 million last year in December. We've got a few $1 million in subordinated debt, and we've raised a little under 11 million in project development, capital as well through a loan facility. So that's what we put together to operate and to take these projects from inception to their current status.
And just generally speaking, the indigenous and native aspect of this and the economic development potential, are your investors down for that? Is that what's part of the appeal, or is that there's always, a lot of these areas have been undercapitalized, underinvested over time. So how is that playing?
And that's what to give a little context, like, these communities, these indigenous communities have been, you know, um, really like in unique financial situations for decades, meaning that they're like, I always say like scarcity is an abundance on tribal, communities, because you have these situations where because of their political status and the uncertainty around their marketplaces, a lot of commercial financial banking doesn't exist there. You don't really have like traditional retail banking that supports businesses. And so, we're attacking this from a totally different angle. And typically tribes work through their public institutions, whether it's their governments or enterprises created from the government, to navigate these, because normally they're the only ones with the capacity to navigate, these minefields. But what we did was we went out to the world that has been largely looking at indigenous communities and wondering, like, what is it going to take, to create opportunity there? How do we transform these economies to be more responsive to the opportunities that are arising out of this transition? And so we also have to build this like new financial discipline in these communities, because I always say like our indigenous governments act like, like they don't use banks, they store cash in a mattress. Let's say it's literally the level of like financial sophistication that's existed, partly because tax credits haven't been available, or a lot of the strategies of like financial capital stacking haven't been effective in these communities because there hasn't been projects to work out the mechanics. we're also playing a role in, really thinking differently about how to capitalize companies, but also how do you capitalize projects using, that kind of sweet spot of public and private capital with, this objective of trying to establish a new marketplace. Because I think that's the thing, like Michael was saying, is once you get past this, tremendous like early stage risk part, there's, everything looks standard beyond that in terms of the way things are structured and the way they're financed. But it's getting over that hump that we really, have to go to a lot of these investors and say, like, even the governments that exist in these places find problems with investing in this stage of development and are looking to other sources. And so we took that on ourselves to say we think we can figure that out, and we have been figuring that out to bring and mobilize capital in an industry and in a marketplace that has largely been like behind like this. It's almost like it's been preserved nicely because there's a lot of infrastructure and a lot of opportunity, but there people have been kind of looking at it trying to wonder, how do we get over there, how do we build this bridge to access this place? And that's what Navajo Power has been facilitating for the last couple of years.
So do you sense a change in kind of the ability to do business and the environment on Navajo Nation? Are these kinds of projects having a broader impact on other kinds of businesses and other entrepreneurship and finance, access to finance, all the parts of the ecosystem that are required?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is like there's a lot of different needs in these communities, and one of the main common denominator that's like preventing a lot of opportunities from coming is this world of finance that has a difficulty in finding its reasoning for siting on tribal territories. We're essentially doing real estate transactions that are overlaid with these very, secured contracts for power purchase and services. So at the fundamental level, these are the basic mechanics that you have to prove in order to create these marketplaces. Because once that stability is established and all agreed upon rules can be standardized, now financial institutions can price the risk and they can understand exactly what it is they're going into. And you can start working on creating an efficiency of de risking those policies, improving tax regimes. And, that's really what we're working on is as interesting as it is we're this energy company that's developing utility scale. We're really good at that too. Like we love talking technology, but we're finding ourselves being a pivotal role player in shaping how these things are financed and how they're even just characterized so that these different institutions can process their role to support the development of these projects, whether it's governments and their regulatory entities or investors, and how they can sit alongside entities like us. And that's what I feel the most proud of in what we're doing is we're really utilizing like our advantages to try to create an understanding that creates those opportunities, and rather than looking them at challenges as has the characterization of how it is to work in tribal communities. We don't see it that way. We see them as once you can figure those things out, you unlock everything else, including developing, commercial real estate and manufacturing and all these other auxiliary pieces that could be fundamental to creating a strong economy around these projects. We just need to land that big anchor that can standardize how these communities want to be embraced so that they can continue to explore these other opportunities that they want to bring into their homelands.
That's terrific, Michael. Let me give you the last word and just give you a chance to say what you need or what would move things forward from this community of agents of impact.
Sure. Yeah. I would just say, it's still early days. And once we get into construction of these multi-billion-dollar projects, we're really going to see a lot of change in these communities. And once, the millions of dollars of community benefit money, on top of all of the economic activity around construction and operations of these huge power plants, that's when things are going to get really interesting in the years to come. We spent the last 7 years laying a foundation, and it's been kind of subtle and hard to see. but the foundation's strong, and we're going to build help build a really amazing new revitalized economy in the communities that decide to host these infrastructure projects. In terms of Navajo Power, we have been incredibly inclusive to philanthropists and investors who want to back us. And of that 25 million that we've raised to date, I think we have close to 50 different investors, from people who put $250 into subordinated debt on Catacap to us, to investors like Builders Vision and the Kellogg Foundation, who've done $3 million investments into our different rounds and helped really anchor things. In terms of where we're at, we're going to continue to be, putting together tranches of risk capital to, power our growth, and to be able to expand our service offering across Indian country. Because while we have a 2 gigawatt pipeline now, our market research shows that just on solar alone, there's over a 200 gigawatt potential in Indian country across the U.S. And the vision of Navajo Power is to develop 40 of those 200 gigawatts by 2040. So we have a long way to go. Our pipeline's about 5% of the way to our ambition at this point. So, the invitation is to join the community, invest into the ecosystem, and if you have that kind of interest, we can find a structure to enable such partnership and collaboration.
Terrific. Well, Michael and Brett, we're going to be watching Navajo Power and this whole development of this whole ecosystem that you talk about. So we hope you'll come back and update us soon. And thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, David.
That's going to do it for this Agents of Impact podcast. Thanks to Brett, Michael, to our producer Isaac Silk, and to the whole team at Impact Alpha. And to all of you, Agents of Impact, thanks again for all that you do.